This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning. But we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 7th of July, 2020, and I am 2J.
I am JM.
And I am GK, and in case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, Uhuru's risky gamble. In the Standard, it's freedom for now, but what next?
Yes.
And in the Star, MPs want EACC to investigate 11 state agencies. Let us begin with the Daily Nation.
Yes.
Uhuru's risky gamble. Now, yesterday's speech by Uhuru Kenyatta could have been called the dilemma of two rights, because he said that, you know, he had to make a decision between economic lives or, you know, conditions or the health of our people.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was as black and white as that. I think he came to a healthy compromise between the two of those things, that work must continue, but you must also keep yourself safe. Now, when Uhuru asked us to take up or increase our civil responsibilities, Kenyans seem to have taken it to mean that you're on your own. And I don't think that's what Uhuru Kenyatta meant. I think it was a call for action, similar to what many presidents around the world have done. They've said, listen, this is your country. You must love your country enough to protect it, to protect yourselves, and to want to change for the good.
Yeah.
And he made a point. The police doesn't have enough resources to police everybody. So you have to be
Police
responsible
yourself,
for yourself.
Yeah.
I think the only update as of today is that CS Magoha made a statement saying that schools will reopen in 2021. So there'll be no KCPE and no KCSE exams in 2020.
Yeah.
And that, you're basically, whatever year you were in, between grade 1, 4, 5, 7, Form 1 and 3, you will go back to that class next year.
Yeah. And interestingly, he also said that all students are created equal, right?
Yes.
That there should be no difference between
public and private schools. So
it's also good that the president addressed some of the social challenges that have arisen out of this COVID time.
Yeah.
So, you know, the child pregnancies, the gender-based violence happening in homes right now.
Yeah.
He's come down hard on perpetrators and has formed that task force to look to, you know, to give recommendations about way forward.
Yeah. And these are shadow pandemics. Yeah, they've been happening in the background.
Precisely.
So that's good.
Yeah, on that note, the Standard pretty much talks about the same. It's freedom for now, but what next? Uhuru's gamble. The options were limited and the president chose to err on the side of caution. With easing travel curbs, 21-day walk to a longer lockdown may have just begun. But will Kenyans behave? And I like that they've taken on that angle.
Yeah.
They start by saying that the president bowed to pressure, which just very quickly, I will disagree with that. I do not think the president bowed to anything. I think he made a very measured decision, you know. He said, I'm battling two rights. He didn't say one was right, one was wrong. He said, I have to balance what's happening. And right now, the future or the state of the economy at this point does need to come first. Again, as GK has mentioned, he, you know, really put that in the front, the idea that we have to share this burden. We are adults. A lot of us, we have the ability to make correct decisions, and I think that we should place that burden on ourselves equally as much as we do place that on the government. He said, of course, we must therefore exercise cautious optimism and avoid reckless abandon. And I could not agree more.
I also like that he asked us to enter a joint venture with the government, which I thought was an interesting take on a perspective on the crisis.
It's very true.
Okay, so we have a 3-part criteria that we will use to break down the headlines. We'll ask ourselves, is it topical or speculative? Is it repetitive or groundbreaking? And is it thoughtful or just plain lazy? Sounds a bit repetitive given that we talked about this yesterday. But it is topical because it is a pronouncement that has just arisen. I like Uhuru's risky gamble, has a good ring to it. The Standard?
I would say just straight off the back, I think we can toss the Standard. Let's see what the Star has to offer.
So the Star has taken a completely different angle today.
MPs want EACC to investigate 11 state agencies. So the findings of the National Assembly's Public Investments Committee into the conduct of parastatals have recommended anti-graft investigations to be conducted on at least 11 state corporations due to what appears to be flawed procurement and massive financial impropriety. So the report covers the time period between 2013 and 2018. The investigations are supposed to be retrospective, therefore. And the adversely mentioned parastatals, amongst others, are Kenya National Highways Authority, the Kenya Airports Authority, Kenya Pipeline Corporation, Kenya Ports. And just to give you an idea of some of the things that the MPs flagged, apparently the former MD of KAA, Stephen Gishuki, he should be reprimanded, they say, for failing to repossess grabbed Wilson Airport land.
How brave.
Again, the KPC managing director, apparently under his leadership, the organization procured a software, an e-budgeting system worth about 50 million, which has never worked. And then the Kenya Ports Authority wants investigations into why the board decided to invest 2.9 billion shillings in Chase Bank just before it collapsed a few years ago. So those are some of the alleged things that went on. And basically there should be investigations into all of that. It's a whole laundry list of all that impropriety.
Does the Star give any conclusions, any analysis, or do they just regurgitate information?
They've just basically cited the report. They haven't.
And they're also assuming that those in the board knew that Chase Bank was going to collapse before it did, or
important question.
Lots of speculation there.
Yes.
So who do we give our winning headline?
Toss the Star.
Yeah, so we are left with the Daily Nation.
Yes.
That gives us our winning headline. Onto the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country, where we also have a 3-part criteria. We ask ourselves, is it humorous or dry? Is it satirical or pessimistic? And is it effective or just plain lazy? If we begin with the Daily Nation, we have a caricature of President Uhuru Kenyatta getting ready for his presidential address. And in front of him, he has 3 options, 3 shirts, very colorful, purple, red, and green, from Rivertex Fashion, no doubt, which is Kenyan. And so one of them has just the key. The middle one has the key and the padlock, and the last one is a lockdown shirt. It just has the kufu. And I think
tough choice.
and it says tough choice. And Dula is making fun of the fact that Uhuru always has these shirts. There's the silky ones that we've been seeing, and when you see the silky ones, you know he's about to do some stuff. But with this, I thought this was a good cartoon.
Very good cartoon.
Yeah, and the shirt he was wearing yesterday looked like an answer sheet. You'll see
according
that
to
on
Twitter,
according to Twitter.
So are these shirts from Rivertex?
Yeah, apparently they are.
I think that's what he's suggesting.
Then the Rivertex is not doing branding. They're not very serious about the brand.
Do you know
because what they should do
should
is have a logo or have an emblem somewhere,
or maybe
that is always visible,
yeah.
and that the Kenyans can see.
And
then we start buying Kenya.
A Rivertex logo
to look like uniform.
I mean, it's supposed to be a brand. It's not necessarily Rivertex, but they can create a brand out of this.
Yeah, and he's putting his money where his mouth is. He's saying, if I'm telling Kenyans to buy Kenya, build Kenya, I am the one to do it.
That's true.
Very funny one from Dula. Let's move to the Standard.
In the Standard from Gado, we have a pair of very large Oxford brogue shoes, and on the insole of one of them it says Uoko AG. Ouko AG. And sitting in between, straddling between the 2 shoes, is a young lady. We assume it is a caricature because the paper says there, of Nancy Gathungu, who is one of the nominees for the new position of Auditor General. Yeah. And so I guess here, obviously, he's saying that she has some big shoes to fill. However, I'm going to take a page out of DM's book and question this sexist narrative that Gado is trying to push. For those of you who don't know, Nancy was the former Director of Audit of the Auditor General. So she's not an unqualified woman. She has a lot of experience, and I think for him to undermine those qualifications and put her in this light is very unfair. So I think we wish her all the best as she goes through the nomination process, and we hope that she does get that position.
Can we toss it then?
Yes,
toss it. It's not a very creative rendition.
Okay, so in the Star.
In the Star, pressure to reopen. So here we have a caricature of the president in a bottle with the coronavirus pushing him out. And he has kicked open the cork that represents lockdown. The cartoon depicts the president's decision to announce the phased opening of the country. a comical one here. And you know, what's his name? Ozone had done a cartoon similar to this, I think about 30 days ago. Huru in the bottle, COVID pushing him up, but he was really holding back. He didn't want to pop it. And there you can see on his face, he's in a double bind about whether to open the economy or not.
So it's between the Star and the Daily Nation. I like the Daily Nation.
I like the Daily Nation too.
I
think it's funny.
So there you have it, a winning cartoon from Ndula of the Daily Nation. And now for our final thought. But before we get there, please hit subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And now our final thought. Today is inspired by a book entitled Democracy for Realists: Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government. And in line with this week's theme, this book today is dedicated to the citizens of Kenya. Every single one of you.
The electorate.
The electorate. And so this book challenges the folk version of democracy that presumes that voting is undertaken by an all-knowing, understanding, sovereign citizen. And so I'll just break down what that means very simply. So the authors take aim at the romantic notion of democracy, this romantic ideal of it, which they describe as folk theory. So this folk theory of democracy is grounded in the tradition of rational choice, that voters seek information, weigh up the available evidence, and then choose a government with the strongest policies to deliver on their own personal desires. And so according to the authors, this ideal does not resemble how democracy works at all. They say, in fact, this completely competent sovereign citizen is an unattainable myth. That voters are incapable and uninterested in fulfilling the role required of them by democracy. So they say that most people are far too busy with jobs and families to give any care about politics or to give it sufficient attention. So rather than spending their free time studying trade deals or infrastructure planning, they say that people would quite understandably pursue more enjoyable pastimes like drinking, or as Jonathan would like to say, exchanging ignorance.
Or reading.
Or reading. So they say that even if there is this minority of voters who do have the time and the penchant to inform themselves about politics, they do not behave as this folk theory contends in terms of weighing up the pros and the cons. When faced with choice in a democracy, human judgment is overwhelmed by the complexity of the world, and instead people just end up focusing on self-interest. So they say voters use information not to challenge their own opinions, to see whether they are right or wrong, but rather to rationalize their own opinions, which the authors describe as enhanced bias. And this is something that we've talked about before. It's a form of cognitive dissonance, when an individual holds inconsistent beliefs and opinions. And so they say that voters rather adjust their views to those of their favorite party, or simply avoid finding out what their party's position is if it is in difference to what they believe. So the authors argue that voters are also afflicted by what they call duration neglect. Where individuals are only able to recall the past few months and are therefore incapable of assessing the political performance over a normal term period. So what has the president done for us in the past 7 years? They say that voters are guided by their own personal circumstances, often punishing leaders when economic conditions worsen and rewarding them when they improve, paying little attention to their actual track record. So they illustrate this point by looking at the example of Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1936 landslide election win. So they say that their analysis found that this election was not an endorsement of the presidential candidate's economic stimulus package in light of the Great Depression, but rather it was a consequence of a rather small economic upturn in the months up to the election. So it had nothing to do with what he was going to do, but more so with what happened just before the election happened. And so what they conclude by saying is that instead of democracy's rational voter, most voters base their political decisions on who they are rather than what they think. Voters choose parties which represent their culture, their community, and stay in line with their political tribe or their other kinds of tribes, so long as they see that they are going to serve their interests. And so I would ask Kenyans, do you see that this reflects you in any way?
I really hope they do. As you very well know, I'm not a big fan of democracy. So this book, I agree with it 100% completely. It exposes all the flaws, all the biases of the citizens, of the electorate. And so I'll talk a little bit about duration neglect. And the author examines the rationality of economic voting and debunks the long-held assumption that economic distress is politically damaging to incumbent leaders. So using statistical evidence from election years in the United States, political scientists, the author tells us, discovered that on polling day, voters tend to be myopic or to be short-termist in how they vote. So rather than assess their economic conditions over the incumbent's entire term in office, they tend to remember his or her final months. And so therefore, if the economy is flourishing in the final weeks of the campaign, when the music stops, the incumbent is likely to be re-elected. And that's for two reasons. Number one, it is in part because voters have a great difficulty assessing their own welfare objectively. But number two, in the words of Andrew Kohut, a notable American pollster, he said, and I quote, "Ordinary people don't have a good sense of what the president can and cannot do about the economy. Their perception is that he is responsible for how they are faring. And if he does not acknowledge their complaints, they judge him as indifferent and not doing a good job." So, you know, the electorate are largely indifferent. They don't quite know the intricacies of how the government works, how the government orders the economy and what have you. And then as a result, on election day, as far as voting on the economy is concerned, they tend to be at best arbitrary and at worst myopic. And so over time, this trend has induced what the author calls the political business cycle phenomenon, in which the incumbent attempts to stimulate the economy in periods immediately preceding the election. And he tells us that Nixon and Reagan were energetic manipulators of economic instruments to yield immediate results for the electorate just before the election seasons. One more thing I would like to say as I conclude on this segment of the book. We are in the month of July. Just this morning, I've seen some Saba movements happening, and the civil society is demanding for I don't know what. They can barely articulate it. But I'm reminded of a quote by Barrington Moore, a political scientist, who said, "No bourgeoisie, no democracy." And my thinking is that if the civil society want better outcomes, they should look to shrinking the size of the electorate that is accountable to the government. So rather than have a wide electorate to whom the government is accountable to, they should shrink that so that the people who hold the government to account are actually a narrow set of people who are very deeply invested in the economy. If you decide to allow all 25 million people to vote, the elites will inevitably end up skewing and playing games with their emotions, and that's how you end up with leaders in office who continually embezzle funds and so on and so forth. So, that is the extent to which democracy fails to work for the sake of the masses.
Interesting. So in chapter 8, they talk about the group theory of politics. So they go further to debunk this idea of democracy working for everybody and the majority. And so he says that they say that voting behavior primarily reflects and reinforces voter social loyalties. And so they speak a lot about groups and culture and how this influences the voter. So they quote Karl Marx, and they say that he saw that entire societies possessed a culture, economic classes within a society that then generated the subcultures, and that these subcultures are what influence what each class believes, what they value, what actions they're willing to take to defend this class. And so he says that all the great issues of life, religion, nationality, gender roles, popular scientific ideas, even the value of different occupations, the appeal of different foods, are taught to the vast majority of people by their family, their culture, and their subcultures. And we can see that playing out in Kenya's 47 cultures. We know which professions some people gravitate towards if you're from a different tribe, but those are taught by your subcultures. I wouldn't say which, in case I get bad comments. But in politics, the authors of this book see the ability of intense minorities to get their way when the majority is apathetic, when they're uninterested and they're unorganized. And so therefore, groups are not just vehicles for pressuring government, but as the mainsprings of political attitudes and interests. So we've seen the springing up of the dynasty and the hustler narratives, and that is a political manipulation. There's a deliberate attempt to see some as us and some as others, right? And so they go on to give us an experiment by this man named Henry Tajfel, who showed how people can be randomly assigned to meaningless groups, but they begin to favor their fellow group members against others, even though they know nothing about anyone else involved in the group, and they themselves do not profit from picking this group or being loyal to it. And no prior group conflict has occurred. And so they call this the minimal group paradigm, which demonstrates the human capacity for joining groups and disliking other groups is very close to the surface. And this can be manipulated very easily and mobilized politically. So as an electorate, you have to start to see where in which you're being, which groups and social groups you're sort of being boxed into. And so he says that stereotyping can lead to seeing the other as evil, even subhuman. And so these group tensions are what are then mobilized and brought to the surface. And we must see these social constructions really for what they are. So in America, because this book is heavily American, they say that American voters identify hugely with the political parties, and your party identification profoundly shapes your choices on election day. So in Kenya, we've primarily voted, with our tribal blocks. That's why you hear the Gema block, the Luya nation, or whoever it is. And these have been shaping how people have voted. However, can we argue that this may change in 2022? Is it shaping up to be a different social group that is being sort of positioned for picking? Are you being told that you should pick this one and this one based on social class or other things? So this book really put food for thought, I think, for me. So on a day where we had a winning headline from the Daily Nation and a winning cartoon from the Daily Nation, I want to leave you with this from Shumpita, who reminded us that democracy does not mean and cannot mean that the people actually rule in any obvious sense of the terms rule and people. Democracy means only that people have the opportunity of accepting or refusing the men who are to rule them. The electorate has only a great and perhaps principal role as an appraiser of past events, past performance, and past actions. And as JM told us, we only really remember the closest, venture, the thing that excited you the most, or the thing that put money in your pocket. So maybe as Uhuru's stimulus package comes into effect in 2022, he will leave with a good legacy when we have money in our pockets. So please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, but also find us on TV. We're on GoTV, Time for to Air, and Start.